tools, you can change colors, and you can change the brush size. So the things that are a little bit different, most of this is stuff you've already done. I've added these new sets of buttons, which is new. And then the other thing I've done is I've organized my code differently. So let me talk to you about the organizing of code. Once your code starts to get more complicated, like in this case, I've got all these different buttons and things, it gets more and more annoying to have one giant file. So our first project, we just had a canvas.typescript file with everything, and main just imported canvas. So in this case, if I go to my main.js file, it imports app/app. Now the slash means it's in a folder. So I've started organizing my code in a folder because it's a little more complicated. And here when I go ahead and open up this folder itself has a bunch of files. I could have imported each of those files in this main, but instead what I've done is I've just imported the main one and then this app.app. Sometimes that would actually be called index. That would be a little bit more typical. Actually, I probably should. I'll go ahead and rename that index. So if I call that index, in that case, I can just import app, and it knows to grab the index, hopefully. Yep, perfect. So the index tells me everything that's in the folder. And this one is going to import only 3 of these files that are necessary. So it imports my buttons, which sets up all the buttons, the listeners, which sets up the event listeners for the drawing. So that sets up either the click or the drag. And then my brush size input, I have a separate file just for this fancy brush size input because it's a little more complicated. How many files I have is up to me. I could have, for example, had a color buttons file and then a shape buttons file. That would be totally reasonable. But let me show you how imports and exports work. So if I just want to say, hey, just run that code, I can just say import, and it'll just import the whole file and make sure that the code in it runs. Normally, though, I want to do something a little bit different. So let's take a look at canvas.typescript. That's what we're used to. Canvas, what my canvas TypeScript file does is it just sets up this base canvas. It sets the width and the height, and it grabs that CTX variable that we're used to. So it grabs the drawing context. The things I had to do to use these in other files whereas our original one just said let canvas or let context, here I just add the word export before it. When you add the word export before something, it means that other files can import it. So here, for example, I've exported CTX, which is that drawing context. Now let's take a look at the brushes, which is where I do my drawing. And here in the brushes, I have this line, import, and then in braces CTX from canvas. So the canvas gives me the name of the file. If I go back to canvas, in the canvas file, I have export let CTX, and that's that canvas rendering context. And then in the brushes file, I call import CTX. So that's how we basically pass a variable from one file to another. So now in this brushes file, I know I have a drawing context, and then I just write these drawing functions, each of which takes 2 numbers and draws a shape at those coordinates. So I made a draw triangle, draw a square, and draw a circle. I also made a brush size here. This thing exports a brush size, and then it uses this brush size variable inside of its other functions. So draw a circle, draw a square, and draw a triangle all use brush size. You can't change a variable that's been exported, so I had to make a separate little function to set it. So this function here called setBrushSize just enables my other code to change the brush size. So I've got a set brush size. I have a very similar approach in my listeners here, where I have a current tool variable, which is the function that does the drawing, and then I made a set function export function set current tool, which just sets the tool that does the drawing. and then this just calls whatever the current tool is. And then my buttons code imports set current tool. It imports my code for each of the brushes, and then it has this function here that makes a button, and then it goes ahead and it sets the current tool. I made a little convenience function to make the triangle, square, and circle ones, and then those in turn make the button and then set the current tool to the button. So the triangle one sets it to draw triangle, square to draw square, and circle to draw circle. So that's a little bit complicated for sure. This code also has a loop of colors, so I made for each color, I create a button that just sets the fill style to that color. But it's much nicer. Each of these files is like 50 lines long. I find that's a very nice way to work. So I made each of my files, 40, 50 lines long, not too bad. My brush size input, for example, it's a little more complicated because I had to create this little label brush, and then I created this number input, and then I also made this little square that grows when I grow the number input. So this is kind of a complicated bunch of code, but from the outside perspective, it's really simple. I import set brush size, and I import my button box. I add all of my HTML to the button box, and then on the input event listener, all I'm really doing is calling set brush size. So this just sets the brush size to a number that I'm getting from this input. And then I also have this little indicator style width and height, which is what makes that square indicator grow when the brush size changes, so you can see your brush size before you draw. If I were being cleverer, I would also provide maybe a variable that said what shape was being drawn, and then I might actually make that the shape, but I'm not quite that clever yet. Actually, the fanciest way to do that would be to put another canvas there and then just draw the shape on the canvas using the brush. That would be kind of an elegant way to do this, but I'm not doing this the elegant way. So there you go. That's a sample drawing app, and that's the export and import syntax being used to simplify my code. I was a little, I set this up for you guys yesterday and then didn't share it because the TypeScript hinting, the hover hinting, and the autocomplete wasn't working for me, and I thought there was a bug. What I've come to believe is that if you just hit refresh on the browser page, those things start working. So I'd say about a third of the time they don't work well for me. I just hit refresh and then they work. So that's my recommendation to you. All right.